Our next presentation bears the title, Like a Good Neighbor, Churches Should Care. Why the Church Must Fight for Social Justice. Please welcome Anna Leathers.
Abandoned, starving, and freezing. A 15-year-old girl, Hannah, knocked on the door of an orphanage in Bristol, England. The year was 1856. During her first day there, the leader of the orphanage asked everyone to pray for God to provide food, as there is nothing to eat. Within minutes, a baker appeared at the door. Going about his day, he felt called by God to deliver fresh bread to the orphanage. Shortly after, there was another knock at the door. This time, it was a milkman. He explained that one of the wheels of his cart was damaged. His cart was full of fresh milk for his morning deliveries. Not wanting it to spoil, he offered it to them. Warm and full for the first time in weeks, Hannah was amazed. She experienced God's provision and learned of his faithfulness through the ministry of George Mueller. In the past, the church served as the primary source of hope and comfort to the downtrodden. In the past, the church established hospitals, charities, and orphanages. So why is the modern church hesitating to help in the face of great need? Timothy Keller, pastor and theologian, argues that it's the generosity of God, the freeness of his salvation, that lays the foundation of justice for all. However, now we see the state try and fail to fulfill the role of social justice. Seeking to address some of the hardships faced by humanity, such as homelessness, human trafficking, and poverty, and provide aid to victims of social unrest, political upheaval, and injustice. In the past, the church led social movements like the abolition of slavery, as well as establishing the very first hospital and orphanages. All of these ministries were founded to provide care and protection for the vulnerable. Given this rich legacy, why is the church now largely silent in the face of great need and injustice in today's world? Although some think that social justice is a distraction from the core of the gospel and allied with liberal political goals, I argue that it is central to the mission of the church because it is commanded by the Old Testament law and by Jesus himself. Social justice is and has always been rooted in both the Old and the New Testaments. The Old Testament describes the special laws that God had decreed for the Israelites, the laws being the sowers and the sojourners law, which instructed them to provide food from their fields to strangers who happened across their lands. Many of the sojourners were refugees fleeing from violence, unrest, and injustice. Most were homeless and poverty-stricken. The prophets of the Old Testament, Isaiah, Daniel, Nehemiah, and Micah, all taught that the best way to honor God's commandments was through loving one's neighbor. These actions are commanded by Jesus himself. When Christ calls us to love our neighbor as ourselves, to love our enemies, and pray for those who persecute us, he is explaining how he wants his church to act. Other examples can be found throughout the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, in Jesus' teachings, parables, and notably in his actions. Social justice is addressed by the apostles in their works and writings. Paul writes that without love, speeches or deeds are empty and found lacking. How can justice exist without love? Therefore, without love, justice ceases to be justice, but is revenge. The historical social justice seeks to bring reconciliation and justice. Some believers would argue and say that the church is to be a light, and if it were to join social justice, then it would conform to the world. However, I argue that as believers, we can spread the gospel and demonstrate God's love through strangers, through many different avenues, while changing the culture. Social justice is central to living out our faith. It is an act of obedience, and it brings the message of the gospel to the forefront. The church should reclaim its rightful purpose, and with compassion and courage, seek to fulfill its purpose while on earth, to make disciples and to honor and obey God's commandments. Do you remember Hannah? Well, now imagine her in our modern world and its systems. Hannah was saved by the state and placed into the foster care system. At the age of 18, she was turned out and forced onto the streets, where she did what she felt she had to do for money in order to survive. She numbed herself with drugs and alcohol. The Word of God declares that true, undefiled religion is to care for orphans and widows in their time of need. Caring for the poor, the vulnerable, and the forgotten is God's calling to us. We must, as Christians, engage our culture with Christ-like love. This is a cry from all the Hannahs of the world for Christians to act like Christ. Thank you.